A floodlight sweeps across a modern riverside at night, pale and searching, catching ripples of rain and oil as sirens echo somewhere beyond the frame. Water rushes against concrete with a sound like breath held too long. A car sits half submerged, its hazard lights blinking underwater, patient and unreal. No blame is offered, no names are spoken. The camera lingers instead, as if waiting for the river to finish saying whatever it has been saying all along. Then the story drifts upstream, not quickly, but the way memory moves when it is allowed to choose its own pace. The sirens soften. The concrete thins into stone. Streetlights give way to moonlight, and the river narrows into something older. There is a village here, quiet enough that footsteps on wet stones sound loud. Houses lean toward the water as if listening. No one calls this place primitive. No one calls it advanced. It simply exists, shaped around the river rather than placed beside it. Children are taught to greet the water before they are taught to swim. They crouch at the edge, fingers brushing the surface, whispering words that change with the season. Elders do the same, though they no longer whisper. Before important conversations, they touch the river, then their own foreheads, as if aligning thoughts with current. There are no signs explaining why. There is no plaque listing rules, yet everyone moves as if an invisible code is stretched between the trees and tied to the wind. Hands appear in close-up, tying reeds together with practiced calm. The knots are simple, almost careless, but they hold. Nets are set and removed at the same hours each day, regardless of hunger or profit. Fires are never lit too close to the bank. Waste is carried uphill, away from the flow. These actions are not discussed. They are inherited like posture or accent. To ask why would feel like asking why the river runs downhill. Old trees line the bend, their bark marked with pale horizontal scars. The lines are not decorative. They record water that once rose higher than memory likes to admit. Children trace them with their hands and learn where not to build, where not to sleep, where not to forget. In the city, such lines would be measured, argued over, then ignored. Here they are treated as sentences written by the river itself. What we are usually told is simple. Floods are disasters, random and cruel, made worse by chance. What is rarely mentioned is how carefully people once watched the water before it rose. In places like this village, the river was not scenery. It was a neighbor with moods, habits, and limits. You did not conquer it. You negotiated quietly, every day. Modern cities build as if water is decoration, something to be framed by glass and lit for photographs. Rivers are straightened, narrowed, hurried along so they will not interfere with schedules. When they overflow, we act surprised, as if the water has broken a promise. Villages like this understood something different. They built as if living near a river was an agreement, renewed constantly through attention and restraint. These customs were never written down, yet they endured longer than most laws carved in stone. They were not superstition. They were survival, disguised as politeness. The river never needed to change. It waited. Humans did. And as the camera drifts closer to the water's surface, the question settles in, calm but insistent. If these rules were never on paper, where were they kept? And what happens when no one remembers how to listen anymore? Its answer does not arrive as thunder or warning, but as silence between ripples, inviting us to follow the current backward, beyond memory and myth, toward the place where knowledge once lived inside bodies, gestures, and breath. Before writing replaced watching, and forgetting slowly began to feel normal everywhere. The camera follows a narrow path villagers walk without thinking, feet finding places memory already knows. It passes a bent tree, a dull stone, a patch of soil no one farms. Nothing is announced as special, yet the silence around each landmark feels deliberate, almost attentive, as night watches quietly. To outsiders, these markers appear accidental, leftovers of weather and time. To the village, they function like drawers in a cabinet. Each holds information retrieved by walking, not reading. Where paper dissolves and officials change, the land itself remembers precisely what humans must not forget during every dangerous season remembered. Flood heights are etched into bark with careful hands, lines pale against darkened trunks. Children learn to measure years by touch. A shrine marks where houses should stop, not as prayer, but as boundary. No instruments are required when reverence already keeps distance through storms, memory, habit, repetition, patience, time. There is a song sung at night, often mistaken for comfort alone. Its verses name months, currents, pauses. Certain words are never sung aloud during specific seasons. Outsiders hear melody and myth. Locals hear instruction delivered gently, memorized before literacy, enforced by routine across generations, quietly, accurately, without exception remembered. This is where confusion begins. Visitors record stories, photograph shrines, catalog customs as folklore. They assume flexibility where none exists. The village does not debate these practices. They obey them. Not because they fear punishment, but because deviation has consequences already witnessed, absorbed, and never dramatized by the river itself. A modern engineer unfolds a printed map beside the water, its lines clean and confident. Measurements are correct, data verified. He explains projected flood zones with certainty. An elder listens, then points without looking, naming the reach of the worst season. Both are accurate. Only one is complete for survival. The paper map describes space as fixed, obedient, abstract. The village map lives in gestures, pauses, and paths walked daily. One can be folded and misplaced. The other disappears only when attention fades. The most important rule was never written, because writing was always easier to lose than memory, lived. As this invisible library reveals itself, a pattern sharpens. Every marker answers a single question. How close is too close? The river is not hostile, but it demands room. Not as threat, but as rhythm. Give it space, and it gives time. Deny it, and it collects payment slowly, patiently. Villagers walk these boundaries daily without measuring, without announcing intention. Children play up to certain stones and never beyond. Houses cluster where history permits, leaving empty ground that appears wasted to developers. That emptiness is reserved for water's arrival, a space prepaid by restraint rather than regret remembered, enforced, shared. Seen from outside, it looks inefficient, even foolish. Why surrender valuable land to a river that is absent most days? Inside the system, the logic is calm and exact. Space is cheaper than rebuilding. Waiting is safer than warning. The river does not need reminders. People do eventually, always, painfully. The camera lingers on that unused ground, grass bending where water will someday pass. Nothing is built there, yet everything depends on it. This is the first volume of the river's unwritten law, stored in absence rather than ink. And it asks a simple question modern places rarely consider anymore. How much space does a river require to remain generous rather than destructive? The answer is never a number. It is learned through loss, remembered through habit, and enforced through agreement. As attention drifts downstream, the story prepares to open the rule beneath this one, deeper and harder to ignore. It begins with distance, but it does not end there. Space is only the surface lesson. Beneath it waits another rule, quieter and more demanding, about timing, restraint, and knowing when not to act. The river teaches this next law without urgency, assuming those who listen will follow eventually, willingly. The premise is introduced quietly, like the beginning of a treasure hunt meant for those willing to walk slowly. There are 10 chapters in this search, each one uncovering a river law once enforced without paper or police. Shame, ritual, and shared memory did the work instead. These methods felt gentle on the surface, almost invisible, until you realize how strict they were and how rarely they were broken without consequence. The river itself is not romanticized here. It is not wise or cruel. It is predictable in its own wild way, repeating patterns with patience that outlasts generations. What changes is human attention. When people watched closely, the river behaved exactly as expected. When they stopped watching, it seemed to turn suddenly dangerous, though it had not altered its habits at all. The first faces return as familiar guides. A fisher stands by the bank at dusk, hands resting, net untouched. There are nights he will not cast, no matter how full the water looks. He does not explain this as belief. He says simply that the river needs those nights to move things humans cannot see. He has never argued with the result. Further upstream, a farmer kneels with a shallow bowl, filling it from the current. He places it on the ground and waits. The length of a shadow crossing its surface tells him more than gauges ever could. He plants later than his neighbors, harvests calmly, and rarely loses fields. The method looks slow. It is, in fact, precise. A grandmother walks the edges at dawn, eyes scanning plants most people step over. She knows which leaves curl early, which flowers close too soon. These are not omens to her. They are announcements. When she begins storing grain differently, the village pays attention without asking why. No one needs the explanation twice. Then there is the city planner, standing uncomfortably between worlds. He admits, without defensiveness, that modern rules often ignore what locals once treated as sacred. Regulations are written to be universal, he says, while rivers are not. Data arrives late. Concrete arrives earlier. Consequences arrive last, when revision is expensive and lives are already rearranged. Here, the first twist settles in gently but firmly. Many of these so-called traditional laws align almost perfectly with what modern science now recommends. Leave floodplains open. Respect seasonal flow. Do not interrupt sediment movement. Do not force speed where patience exists naturally. The discoveries are not shocking. The surprise is that, even knowing this, cities still break them. If ancient villages solved river problems without apps, alarms, or concrete, why are modern cities drowning with all three? The question hangs without accusation. It does not demand guilt. It invites comparison. Knowledge has increased, yet obedience has not. The tools grew louder. The listening grew quieter. This is not a story about nostalgia. No one suggests returning to keys or abandoning progress. It is about recognizing that efficiency replaced agreement and speed replaced memory. Old laws did not slow life for no reason. They slowed it where rushing carried hidden costs, paid later by someone else. As the structure becomes clear, anticipation replaces confusion. 10 chapters, 10 laws, each one simple enough to remember, strict enough to matter. They were enforced not by fear but by belonging. To break them was not illegal. It was embarrassing. It marked you as someone who made life harder for everyone else. The hunt is no longer abstract. It has direction. Each rule will be opened carefully, not as a command, but as a recovered habit. The first is also the most misunderstood because it looks like surrender to those who measure success by control alone. It is the law of expansion. The idea that a river must be allowed to grow, temporarily and without punishment, if it is to remain generous the rest of the year. This is where modern thinking resists hardest. And this is where the story finally steps forward, toward the water's edge, to see what happens when space is denied. The next chapter waits just ahead, quiet but unavoidable, asking how much ground humans truly own when rivers remember every boundary ever drawn and patiently test it nightly. The camera finds a wide floodplain where grass waves like water even on dry days, bending and rising as if remembering motion. From a distance, it looks empty, wasted, waiting. Up close, it feels purposeful, a room prepared in advance. The river runs nearby, calm for now, but the land around it seems to listen. The narrator describes the river as something that inhales during storms and exhales during calmer months. When rain arrives upstream, the river does not panic. It spreads. It steps outward into this open ground, borrowing space briefly, then giving it back. Villages once understood this rhythm and treated floodplains as temporary rooms the river rented, not land to be stolen and defended. Homes were built on slightly raised ground, just enough to stay dry without standing apart. Barns were set back, patient and replaceable if needed. Crops were planted where loss would hurt, but not destroy. Risk was distributed carefully, so no single mistake could ruin a family or demand sympathy from neighbors who had warned quietly. There is a local story, told without drama. A man decided the open land was wasted. He built closer, tighter, proud of his efficiency. No one stopped him. No authority arrived. When the flood came, the river returned to its wider shape, as it always had. His walls failed first. When he asked for help, the village refused. Not out of cruelty, out of clarity. He had violated a shared agreement everyone else lived by. Helping him rebuild in the same place would encourage the same mistake again. The law was never spoken aloud, yet everyone knew it. Do not trap the river in a narrow hallway and then act surprised when it breaks the walls. The documentary lingers on the contrast without accusation. Soft edges dominate the floodplain. Reeds bend and recover. Wetland plants slow water gently, spreading force into patience. Birds nest where floods will come and go, unafraid of movement. Nothing here pretends permanence. Everything is shaped for return. Then the frame shifts to harsher edges downstream. Concrete banks rise sharply. Steel barriers cut straight lines through old curves. The river moves faster here, louder, compressed into obedience. There are no plants to soften it, no room to pause. When water rises, it has only one direction left to go. No villains are named, no speeches interrupt the images. Suspense builds from inevitability alone. Water always seeks the space it remembers. It presses against walls not because it is angry, but because memory outlasts construction. What looks like overflow is often simply return. The river does not overflow, the narrator says. It comes back to where it always belonged. Floodplains are not mistakes on a map. They are evidence of long conversations between land and water, recorded through repetition rather than ink. Ignoring them does not erase those conversations. It delays listening. Modern maps often erase this subtlety, coloring floodplains as opportunities instead of warnings. Lines become permissions, not memories. The river, unmoved by zoning or optimism, waits for seasons to turn. When it returns, arguments dissolve. Only space remains relevant, measured not in ownership, but in allowance freely given. What was once common sense must now be relearned slowly, after damage makes attention unavoidable again for many communities. For viewers, the rule lands with quiet force because it feels obvious in hindsight. Give the river room. Expect it to use that room. Plan your life where water will forgive mistakes, not where it will punish certainty. This single sentence contains centuries of trial and survival. As the camera drifts across the empty grass again, the floodplain no longer looks unused. It looks busy in advance, holding space for a future moment. And once the idea of breathing room settles in, another question sharpens naturally, almost insistently. If villages could honor this boundary without measurements or contracts, how did they know exactly where to stop? A slow walk along the riverside reveals a line no city brochure mentions. It does not announce itself. It appears gradually, as the path changes underfoot. Soil darkens. Grass grows thicker. Trees stand older, spaced just a little wider, their roots gripping ground shaped by past movement. To most eyes, nothing is happening here. To those who know, everything is being said quietly. The narrator invites attention to details people usually pass without thought. A small altar sits beneath a tree, its offering simple and weathered. A scatter of stones seems decorative, placed without pattern. A row of trunks bears marks that look like age rather than intention. Together, they form a boundary that was never meant to impress, only to endure. This is the forbidden line. Cross it, and you are no longer building beside the river. You are building inside its future. Villages understood this without argument. The line was not drawn once. It was remembered repeatedly, reinforced every time the water returned to a certain height and no further. Each flood revised nothing. It confirmed everything. Outsiders often dismissed this boundary as superstition, an emotional attachment to landscape. In truth, it was a precise record of experience, kept alive through shared memory rather than documents. Where the river reached during the worst years became common knowledge, not because it was written down, but because people survived by not forgetting it. The documentary recreates an old dispute, told softly by those who inherited it. Two neighbors stand on uneven ground, neither raising his voice. One wants to build closer. The other gestures toward the hill, recounting the year the river climbed higher than anyone expected. He names who lost livestock, whose house shifted, where boats floated through fields. The story is not dramatic. Its power lies in detail. No papers are produced, no authority is summoned. The argument ends when both men look at the same ground and imagine the same water returning. Memory resolves what measurements would only complicate. The boundary holds, not because someone enforces it, but because everyone recognizes what crossing it would mean for the group. The twist tightens gently. Modern cities often possess flood maps that echo this same invisible line. Engineers mark zones where water is expected to go. The data aligns eerily well with old altars and tree lines. The knowledge exists. The difference lies in how it is treated. In villages, the boundary was a promise made to the river and to each other. In cities, it becomes a suggestion, adjustable under pressure. Development pushes forward not because the risk is unknown, but because the consequences feel distant, shared, diluted. The river is expected to adapt to ambition. The tone remains calm as the implications sharpen. Where memory once stopped construction entirely, modern plans negotiate with probability. The line becomes thinner, then flexible, then symbolic. Buildings rise just beyond it, then on it, then across it. Each step feels small. The river remembers them all. What looks like an empty field is sometimes a warning written in grass. The absence of buildings is not neglect. It is restraint made visible. When that restraint disappears, the landscape grows quieter, as if waiting for confirmation. The camera rests on a final image. New houses stand in neat rows, fresh walls catching sunlight. An elder points without drama, tracing an arc through the air. This is where the water will return. His finger does not shake. It does not accuse. It simply remembers. No one interrupts him. Construction continues. The river flows calmly nearby, contained for now. The scene holds its breath without music or commentary. The boundary has been found, ignored, and quietly crossed. As the light fades, the question is no longer about knowledge. It is about choice. When a city dares the river to prove the villagers right, it is not asking if the water will come back. It is asking when. Storm footage returns, but this time it moves slowly, like a verdict unfolding. Rain falls without urgency, yet the river rises with certainty. Walls stand firm in one place while water gathers strength somewhere else, unseen at first. The narrator explains, softly, how protection is never neutral. When a barrier saves one bank, it quietly chooses another to sacrifice. Villages understood this danger and feared what they called borrowed safety. If someone blocked the river for themselves, the water did not disappear. It arrived elsewhere, tighter, faster, carrying the weight of the obstruction forward. Safety taken without permission became a debt the river collected downstream. The documentary traces the chain reaction patiently. An upstream wall narrows the channel. The current accelerates, pressed into a thinner corridor. Downstream bends absorb the force, eroding banks that once held. Fields that never flooded before darken overnight, and houses built with confidence find water at their doors. This is the moment that unsettles viewers most. The floodplain, long dismissed as wasted land, reveals its true role. It is not empty. It is a pressure release valve. When water spreads, it slows. When it slows, it forgives. Remove that space, and the river hardens into a battering ram. Engineers speak about control, but control often means relocation. Interviews show how walls meant to protect business districts send water racing toward neighborhoods with fewer resources. The river is not choosing sides. Humans already did, long before the storm arrived. The narrator remains calm, almost tender, while describing these outcomes. There is no anger in the voice because the river itself does not rage. It does not scream or seek revenge. It simply arrives where it is directed, following paths made narrower by decisions stacked quietly over decades. Old villages accounted for this without mathematics. They refused to borrow safety from their neighbors. Mounds were raised slowly, never blocking flow, only lifting life above it. Water passed around them, slowed and moved on. No one downstream paid a hidden price. The contrast arrives without commentary. An aerial shot shows an ancient village mound, grass-covered and dry, surrounded by shallow water that barely moves. The next image cuts to a modern street, submerged to door handles, current racing between walls that refuse to bend. This is not framed as tragedy, but as consequence. Every wall is a decision about who gets wet instead. Each barrier writes a silent verdict that will be delivered later when rain provides the evidence. The river never argues the ruling. Viewers feel the moral weight settle in gently. Solutions are no longer innocent. Protection becomes a choice with a shadow. To save one place is to endanger another unless space is shared honestly. Villages knew this and designed humility into their landscapes. Storm footage slows again, rain tapping roofs like fingers counting time. Sirens echo faintly, but the water moves with quiet purpose. It fills basements, then streets, then memories. Nothing about its movement suggests malice. Everything suggests obedience to physics long understood, then dismissed. As the water settles, the image of the dry mound lingers. It was not stronger than the river. It simply did not challenge it. History drew a line there once and watched patiently as it was crossed elsewhere. The lesson does not accuse. It observes. Space was the first law, and its violation always travels. What feels like safety in one location can become disaster a mile away. The river connects these places whether humans acknowledge the connection or not. As the story prepares to move forward, the water recedes from view but not from thought. With space established as the first rule, another question surfaces naturally, as old as drought and just as dangerous. When water becomes scarce, agreements matter even more. Who drinks first? Who waits? Who is denied? The river teaches that lesson too, quietly, without negotiation. The next law waits downstream, where absence can be as deadly as excess. It is here the story turns from flood to thirst, from expansion to sharing, carrying with it the same quiet warning the river has always given. Those who listened survived both. Those who did not argued later. After the water left, in silence and darkness. Morning arrives in a farming village with a ritual that looks almost ceremonial. Gates are lifted, wooden channels opened, and water guided into fields in a calm, timed sequence. No one rushes, no one argues. The river's quieter face is revealed here because scarcity is its other truth. Flood can destroy in a night, but thirst unravels life slowly, day by day. Villages learned long ago that water, when rare, must never become a subject of debate. Instead of leaving distribution to voices and strength, they made it predictable. Everyone knew whose turn came first, who waited, and how long patience was required. Order removed temptation. When the rules were clear, resentment had nowhere to hide. The camera lingers on details that would be missed by anyone looking only for drama. Notches carved into a beam mark hours that belong to specific families. Stones are moved from one pile to another as water passes, counting time without numbers. A bell rings at dawn, not as celebration, but as agreement. Its sound means the schedule has begun, and no one is exempt. This law is not presented as kindness, it is fairness made visible. Structured peace, rather than generosity, keeps the village intact. A family's survival depends on trusting that the water will arrive when promised, even if today it flows first to someone else's field. Trust is the crop grown before grain. There are consequences for breaking the sequence. They are quiet, but firm. If someone steals an extra hour, channels close for them the next day. No shouting follows. Shame does the work. To disrupt the order is to declare that others matter less, and the community responds by reminding the offender how alone survival truly is. The narrator frames this not as nostalgia, but as design. These systems were built to prevent desperation from turning neighbors into enemies. Water scarcity does not forgive chaos. Villages knew that arguments waste more than time. They waste the future. As the sun climbs, fields fill evenly. No plot looks favored. No family looks desperate. The calm is earned, not assumed. Each movement is small, but together they form a rhythm strong enough to outlast dry seasons. The river becomes a mirror, reflecting whether people choose to share or grab. Tension is planted quietly as the scene widens. Modern cities often assume pumps and money can solve allocation. Water can be pulled from farther away, bought, redirected. But these assumptions weaken when drought stretches longer than budgets and systems built for abundance strain under absence. Pipes do not teach patience. Money does not create trust. When water becomes rare, the real drought is trust. Without it, every delay feels like theft, and every neighbor becomes a suspect. The village avoids this collapse by making fairness unavoidable. The schedule is not a suggestion. It is the backbone of survival. The camera returns to the smallest details, hands adjusting a gate by a finger's width, eyes checking shadows, a child counting stones aloud, learning time before learning numbers. Nothing here feels mystical, yet everything feels deliberate. As water finishes its turn and channels are closed, the bell rings again. The sound carries across fields, signaling completion rather than victory. The system holds because everyone understands it will hold tomorrow as well. A schedule alone, however, is only half the story. Keeping peace requires more than rules. It requires a way to measure time when clocks are rare and seasons shift. As the morning fades, the story prepares to reveal the strange tools villages used to keep time, tools that seem like magic until their logic becomes impossible to ignore. They waited for shadows, dripping bowls, and drifting sounds to replace clocks, proving that precision does not require machines, only attention shared across generations, reinforced daily by necessity, memory, and the quiet understanding that time itself flows like water through seasons, droughts, full floods, and survival. The camera introduces devices so simple they almost invite dismissal. A shallow bowl rests on the ground, a pinhole at its base releasing a steady drip. Nearby, a stick stands upright, its shadow creeping across a marked arc in the dirt. Stones are aligned to the sun's angle, unremarkable unless you know what they are counting. To an unfamiliar eye, these look like toys or remnants of play. The narrator reveals the twist slowly. Many villages measured water the same way they measured daylight. They did not need clocks. They needed agreement. Time was not owned by a device, but shared through observation. When the shadow reached a certain stone, a turn ended. When the bowl emptied, water moved on. The system required no authority beyond visibility. The documentary reenacts a moment of tension, quiet but sharp. A man insists his crops are thirstier today. He gestures to cracked soil, to effort, to need. Voices rise briefly, not in anger but urgency. Then someone points, not at him, but at the bowl. The drip has not finished. Another points to the shadow, still short of its mark. The argument dissolves without victory or defeat. Fairness suddenly has a face. It is not the strongest voice or the oldest story. It is the object everyone can see. No one accuses the man of lying. No one debates his need. The rule stands between them, neutral and unbending. When his turn arrives, it will arrive honestly. They did not argue with each other. They argued with the sun. And the sun, indifferent and precise, never played favorites. This is where the system gains its strength. It removes intention from enforcement. You cannot bribe a shadow. You cannot intimidate a dripping bowl. To cheat would require doing so in full view of everyone else. Here comes the quiet, wait, what? These folk methods mirror modern resource-sharing systems more closely than expected. Transparency, repeatability, public verification. They are hard to manipulate without being seen. Modern algorithms aim for the same outcome, only hidden behind screens and complexity. The village achieved it with dirt, water, and light. The narrator explores why people complied so willingly. It was not fear of punishment. It was the relief of impartiality. When a rule feels human, it invites argument. When it feels natural, resistance fades. The tools carried a hint of sacredness, not because they were mystical, but because they were beyond persuasion. The law was never be nice. It was make fairness undeniable. By anchoring decisions to the environment, villages reduced ego's influence. You could not claim the rule favored someone else. It favored no one. It simply existed, as consistent as sunrise. The camera lingers on faces watching the shadow move. No one speaks. The waiting itself becomes communal. Time is no longer something taken. It is something observed together. This shared patience does more than divide water. It binds people into a single rhythm, reducing the friction that scarcity usually ignites. The lesson sharpens gently. When rules are visible, they survive pride. When they are hidden in paperwork or locked behind expertise, suspicion grows. The village tools look simple, but they solve a complex problem: how to keep people cooperating when resources are tight and emotions run high. As the sun lowers, the shadow reaches its final stone. Channels are closed and opened elsewhere. No one celebrates. No one complains. The system has done its work by removing the need for either. But the narrator lets a new question form. These tools worked because time was local, the sun overhead, the water at hand. What happens when timing is no longer shared by those affected? When a decision made far away shifts the rhythm of turns without warning? The bowl continues to drip, indifferent. The shadow lengthens. Somewhere upstream, unseen hands prepare to change the flow. And the story leans forward, ready to follow what happens when the river's clock is no longer set by those who live beside it. The documentary widens its lens, following the river as it leaves the village and enters a more complicated world. Concrete replaces soil, gates replace reeds. The current is lifted, divided, redirected into channels that lead far from where the water once paused naturally. Dams slow it. Diversions thin it. City intakes swallow it without ceremony. The river still flows, but its rhythm no longer belongs to any single place. The narrator tells a story that begins without drama. For generations, the village schedule worked. The bowl dripped, the shadow moved. Fields drank in their turn. Then one year, the river arrived late. Not absent, not gone. Just unfamiliar. The water crept into the channel thin and hesitant, like a guest who had forgotten the time. Fields cracked sooner than expected. Elders gathered at the edge, staring at the flow as if it had broken a promise. The tools still worked. The schedule still existed. But something felt wrong. No one upstream came to explain. No storm had failed. No season had shifted enough to justify the change. The section treats this moment like a mystery. Questions surface carefully. Did the river betray them, or had it been persuaded elsewhere? Days pass. The bowl empties too quickly. The shadow reaches its mark before the channels feel full. Fairness becomes harder to believe in when the resource itself behaves strangely. The reveal comes in stages, without confrontation. Water, the narrator explains, can be stolen without a thief ever being seen. The theft happens far away, hidden behind distance and infrastructure. Pumps draw quietly, valves open on schedules no one in the village knows exist. By the time the loss is felt, it looks like bad luck rather than decision. Modern systems move water across regions, across borders, across accountability. What was once a shared rhythm becomes a guessing game. The villager's law of turn-taking depends on predictability. When the river's timing changes without warning, trust erodes from the inside. People begin to watch each other again instead of the sun. The tension rises gently. Accusations are not shouted, they are whispered. Someone suggests the schedule needs adjustment. Someone else insists it was fair before. The tools that once calmed disputes now point only to absence. The shadow obeys the sun, the bowl obeys gravity. Neither can explain why the river itself no longer keeps time. The narrator remains calm as the implication sharpens. The river is no longer only a natural force, it is now a political one. Decisions made upstream, far beyond the village's sight, rewrite local reality. The fairness that once felt sacred begins to feel naive in the face of scale. Faces return, familiar but changed. The farmer waits longer than he used to. The grandmother watches plants signal stress she has never seen before. The fisher counts days when the current feels tired. No one can point to a person who took the water. The thief is distance itself. Conflict does not explode. It creeps back in quietly, filling the space left by certainty. When water is scarce and the rhythm unstable, rules lose their authority. Not because they were wrong, but because they were designed for a world where cause and effect were neighbors. The documentary does not condemn modern systems outright. It observes. Scale solved some problems and created others. By removing water from local context, it removed local consent. The village never agreed to share its river with unseen cities. The river simply began arriving altered, reassigned by mechanisms beyond conversation. Sometimes the river doesn't dry up, it just gets reassigned. That sentence hangs as images show pipes stretching across landscapes, carrying water away from places that still wait for it by the sun. The section closes without resolution. The schedule remains, but its power is weakened. Ancient fairness struggles under modern reach. The question tightens like a knot. Can systems built on shared observation survive when decisions are made beyond sight and voice? As the river continues downstream, thinner and faster, another problem looms larger than scarcity alone. When water travels farther and through more hands, it carries more than volume. It carries risk. The next chapter opens on the law villages treated as unforgivable, the one no schedule could repair and no ritual could excuse. Poisoning the flow was never a mistake. It was a betrayal. The narrator shifts into a quieter dread, because poison rarely announces itself. Flood roars and drought cracks the earth, but contamination moves silently, riding the current without sound. In villages, the river was a shared mouth. Everyone drank from the same moving cup, dipped hands into the same flow, cooked from the same source. That intimacy made one rule absolute and unquestioned. Never foul the water above your neighbors. Proximity created accountability in ways no decree ever could. The river passed every house in order, and everyone knew who stood upstream of whom. If someone washed dyes too close to the bank, dumped waste after dark, or bled animals where the current still ran fast, the consequences arrived quickly and unmistakably. They showed up in a child's stomach, twisted in pain by nightfall. They appeared as a neighbor's fever, unexplained and shared. Fish floated belly up, their silver sides turning accusation into fact. The documentary slows, focusing on intimate gestures rather than warnings. Water is poured into clay pots, the surface catching light. A grandmother lifts one and smells before cooking, not out of fear but habit. A child is warned away from a certain bend, told not that it is cursed, but that it is wrong today. No one raises their voice. The river does the speaking. This law was moral and practical at once. To harm the water was to harm someone you would see at sunrise. There was no distance to hide behind, no abstraction to soften responsibility. Upstream action meant downstream suffering, and the path between them was visible, measurable, undeniable. The narrator hints at enforcement without spectacle. There were no prisons built for this offense, no fines tallied on paper. Shame did the first work. Restitution followed. Someone who fouled the water was expected to make amends, to provide labor, food, or care to those affected. If harm continued, help quietly disappeared. Doors closed. Tools were no longer lent. In rare cases, a family found itself alone during planting or harvest, a silence heavier than punishment. Exile did not always mean being forced away. Sometimes it meant being left out. In a place where survival depended on cooperation, exclusion carried real weight. The rule held because everyone understood that poisoning the river was not a private act. It was an attack on the body of the village itself. The river became a witness that carried evidence downstream. It did not accuse loudly. It revealed gently. Illness clustered. Taste changed. Life reacted. No one needed confession when cause and effect shared the same current. The water remembered what humans tried to forget. In this world, pollution had a name because everyone knew where it came from. Responsibility did not dissolve into complexity. It pointed upstream and stopped at a doorstep. This clarity did not make people kinder. It made them careful. Modern eyes might see this as fragile, even harsh. But it worked because it aligned ethics with survival. To keep the water clean was not virtue. It was necessity enforced by closeness. The law endured because breaking it carried immediate, visible consequences borne by people you could not avoid. As the section deepens, the dread grows quieter, more personal. Poison does not crash through walls. It slips into bodies, meals, mornings. Villages understood that preventing it required more than rules. It required watchfulness shared by all, reinforced daily by the simple fact of drinking together. The camera lingers on the river, moving past doorways, past hands, past faces. Every drop connects someone upstream to someone downstream. Harm cannot be contained once released. It travels, patient and honest. If the river was a witness, the narrator asks softly, who acted as judge? Who decided guilt when the water carried proof but no voice? The question settles like sediment, preparing the ground for the next revelation, where justice took shape without courts and judgment flowed as the river. Under a large tree or beside a shrine, villagers gather, not to gossip, but to decide. Mats are laid, voices lowered, and the river murmurs nearby as if listening. The narrator calls this place a river jury, a gathering where disputes are settled without haste, guided by testimony, visible signs, and communal memory rather than force. The twist arrives quietly. Some villages developed early forms of monitoring that feel unexpectedly modern. Fish behavior was watched closely. Insects vanishing from certain reeds raised concern. Foam forming after washing days was noted and remembered. This was not science in lab coats. It was science in bare feet, practiced daily by people whose lives depended on noticing small changes. The documentary reconstructs a case passed down in fragments. A farmer is accused of dumping something bitter into a channel upstream. No one shouts his name. Accusation arrives carefully, like a question. Elders taste the water, only a fingertip, just enough to know something is wrong. They examine plants along the bank, leaves dulled where brightness should be. They ask who walked the river at dawn, who heard splashing after dark. Witnesses speak without performance. One remembers foam drifting farther than usual. Another recalls fish refusing a bend they once favored. Memory overlaps until a pattern forms. No single sign proves guilt. Together they point upstream with quiet certainty. The accused is allowed to speak. He does not face a hostile crowd, but neighbors whose health he understands intimately. His explanation is weighed against what the river shows. Attention, not authority, guides the process. They did not need microscopes. They had attention, sharpened by necessity and shared risk. Punishment is not always harsh. Sometimes it is repair. The farmer may be ordered to clean the bank for weeks, to replace plants, to bring food to those made sick. Compensation restores balance more than suffering ever could. The goal is not to expel, but to mend what was broken before harm spreads again. Yet the law is strict in spirit. The river cannot be treated as a trash pit because everyone's life sits downstream. Repeated harm meets firmer response. Communal help disappears. Trust is withdrawn like water in drought. Survival grows difficult quickly. The narrator keeps the tone steady, almost gentle, so the trial feels like an old song. Familiar, serious, and oddly fair. No one celebrates judgment. Relief comes from knowing the river has been defended and the evidence heard. This system worked because cause and effect lived close together. Harm could not hide behind distance or complexity. The river carried proof, and the village knew how to read it. Attention turned observation into justice. As the gathering dissolves, people return to work. The river flows on, unchanged in appearance, yet restored in meaning. But the narrator leaves a shadow hanging. Attention works best in small worlds. When water begins to travel through pipes instead of past doorsteps, poison no longer has a face. The next section follows that shift, where harm becomes anonymous and judgment loses its footing. It is here that the old certainty begins to thin. Distance blurs responsibility, and time delays consequence. What once arrived by afternoon now takes weeks to appear, if it appears at all. The river still witnesses, but its testimony is scattered, diluted, argued over by experts who never drink from it. Villages fade from cause, leaving effect to strangers. This is not failure of care, but of scale, where attention cannot stretch far enough to hold everyone accountable. The story does not mourn the past. It prepares for the danger ahead, where poison hides inside systems and no gathering tree remains large enough to hold the truth. Without it, judgment dissolves, and rivers carry harm silently until suffering replaces memory entirely. The film moves forward, following that silence into deeper, darker water where listening fails first, long before anyone notices what has already begun there. The river enters the modern city and becomes something else. It is no longer a shared mouth or a watched path. It is a corridor beside roads, a backdrop behind fences, a strip of movement people pass without touching. Few hands meet the water now. Fewer eyes follow where it goes. The narrator describes a chilling change. Pollution becomes invisible, not because it is harmless, but because responsibility dissolves. Waste arrives from many places, each source small enough to deny. A drain here, a pipe there, a habit repeated millions of times. No single act feels decisive, yet the river carries a burden no one admits to placing. Here comes the quiet reversal. Modern life can create dirtier water with cleaner hands. People no longer need to touch the river to change it. A choice made indoors, far away, reaches the current eventually. Distance turns intention into accident. Harm becomes a side effect rather than a decision. The section lingers on the psychology of this distance. When consequences are delayed, guilt fades. When downstream faces are unknown, empathy thins. The river becomes an idea instead of a neighbor. What cannot be seen is easier to ignore, especially when the surface still reflects light and sky. Haunting images replace explanation. Water that looks clear but cannot be trusted slides past concrete banks. Fish are missing from bends they once filled, leaving the water strangely quiet. Children are warned not to swim where their grandparents learned to float, the caution passed down without a story that feels complete. The narrator avoids heavy language, choosing plain words instead. Things you can't see that still change your body. The phrase lands softly, then stays. Illness no longer arrives with taste or smell. It arrives slowly, folded into routines, revealed years later by numbers rather than memory. In the city, pollution does not gather under a single tree for judgment. It disperses through systems designed for convenience. Treatment plants promise distance from consequence. Regulations break harm into acceptable portions. Each piece is permitted. Together, they rewrite the river quietly. The old village law depended on closeness. If you poisoned the water, you saw who suffered. In the city, suffering is downstream and delayed. The river keeps moving, carrying evidence past neighborhoods that never notice its absence of life. People jog beside it. Cars cross above it. Fences keep bodies away, but nothing stops what flows underneath. The river still witnesses everything, but its testimony is scattered across miles and years, difficult to gather into a single truth. The most dangerous water is the kind that looks innocent, clear enough to invite trust, silent enough to escape blame. The danger is not drama, but accumulation, the slow stacking of small allowances until bodies absorb what systems approve. The camera pauses on a stretch where sunlight dances on the surface. It could be beautiful. It is dangerous. Warning signs list rules without stories. No one reads them long enough to feel accused. Responsibility has been abstracted into compliance. The narrator offers no solution yet, only recognition. Old laws tried to prevent this exact problem by keeping harm personal and visible. Modern systems excel at the opposite. They separate cause from effect until neither feels real. The river keeps receipts even when humans stop reading them. It records what passes through, storing evidence in sediment, in flesh, in absence. One day, the accounting arrives without warning, delivered not as blame, but as biology. Even efforts meant to protect can deepen this silence. Filters reassure, reports summarize, delays soften alarm. By the time harm is proven, the source has multiplied, and no single action can be named. The river absorbs blame the way it absorbs waste, carrying both forward until proof feels abstract and responsibility feels optional to everyone involved. Distance trains people to trust appearances, not consequences, until innocence becomes habit, then rule. As the water flows onward, the story prepares to shift again. Poison is not only about what enters the river, but when. Even clean water taken at the wrong moment can wound a system built on timing. The next law waits there, quiet and precise, ready to show how moments matter as much as purity. The narrator introduces the river as a creature with seasons, not just a channel with flow. It wakes and rests, swells and thins, following a calendar older than writing. Villages learned to treat the year like a contract rather than a resource. Certain months belonged to planting, certain weeks belonged to fish, and certain days belonged to the river itself. They were not metaphors. They were boundaries in time. The camera shows rhythms that feel gentle, almost forgiving. Nets are hung up during spawning season, their absence from the water as deliberate as any fence. Sandbanks are left untouched when eggs might be buried beneath the surface. To outsiders, these pauses look like celebration or restraint chosen freely. The documentary lingers on rituals that feel festive, almost playful, but beneath the color and music is enforcement. These were not optional traditions, and they were never framed as kindness. They were timed rules that protected future food. Break them, and hunger arrived on schedule. A fisherman speaks without drama, hands resting on a folded net. He explains why he refuses to cast when the water turns a particular color. It is not fear, it is memory. That color means eggs are drifting, nearly invisible, carried by a current that looks empty. Cast now, and you eat well today while stealing from next season. He chooses tomorrow instead. Upstream, a farmer points to a wild plant blooming at the edge of the field. It appears for only a few days each year. When it opens, the river is about to rise. No calendar hangs on the wall, yet everyone adjusts. Tools are moved, paths are cleared, grain is stored higher. The village shifts before the water does. This law is presented as an agreement with tomorrow. Take less now so the river can refill the pantry later. It is patience formalized. The atmosphere remains bedtime soft, carried by slow water and quieter voices. But the implication sharpens with every example. Timing is the difference between harvest and hunger. Take too early, and the river empties itself of promise. Take too late, and the moment is gone. The river has appointments, and it remembers who interrupts. These patterns were not guessed once and forgotten. They were rehearsed every year, corrected after mistakes, and taught without writing. Children learned by watching adults stop. Stopping was as important as acting. In a world that praises constant use, restraint became intelligence. As the section draws to a close, the river moves steadily, unconcerned with explanation. It keeps time whether anyone is watching or not. The villages endured because they aligned themselves with this quiet clock. They did not command the river to wait. They waited with it. Long after individual names were forgotten, the timing remained. It passed intact through stories, songs, and seasonal pauses. Breaking the rhythm was remembered longer than breaking a tool. The documentary lets these moments breathe, allowing silence to explain what language cannot. Viewers are invited not to admire the past, but to recognize a pattern. Rivers everywhere still keep similar calendars, though fewer people know how to read them. The knowledge has not vanished. It has been ignored. As dusk approaches, nets remain dry, fields wait, and the water darkens slightly. Nothing dramatic happens. That is the point. Consistency, not force, kept the river generous. Those who honored its timing ate. Those who rushed learned hunger first. The pattern feels almost like a secret clock embedded in the land itself. It ticks without sound. It waits for those willing to notice. If villages could read time without instruments, the question naturally follows. How did they keep it consistent across generations? The answer waits in the nights and songs that carried dates when ink could not, preparing the next chapter to listen closely. They kept time by sound, shadow, and repetition, and never lost it. Even when centuries passed, without calendars, written, night settles over the village with lantern light and quiet laughter. Shadows stretch across the riverbank, and the water moves dark and patient beside them. There is music, food, and warmth, yet one rule holds without debate. No one is allowed to fish tonight. The narrator leans into the question gently. Why would hungry people refuse food when it is right there, slipping past their hands? The river looks generous. Nets could fill easily. Still, they remain hung and dry, swaying slightly in the night air. The answer unfolds slowly, like a spell breaking. Villages learned that memory is fragile unless it is given rhythm, so they wrapped rules in festivals, taboos, and repeated stories. What feels like celebration is often structure wearing a smile. A song begins, familiar enough that even children mouth the words. It does more than entertain. Its verses mark a sequence of nights when the river must be left alone. Miss the meaning, and the melody still carries the date. Forget the rule, and the chorus brings it back. Nearby, a dance traces patterns in the dirt, feet landing where others have landed for generations. The steps are not random. They end and begin at the same places each year, signaling a boundary in time rather than space. When the dance is done, a season has closed. They sang the law so no one could forget it. Sound travels farther than instruction. Music survives where orders fade. Even those who do not fully understand still remember when to stop. The "wait, what?" arrives quietly. When researchers later compare these so-called myth dates with the river's behavior, patterns emerge. The nights of forbidden fishing match spawning peaks. The festivals align with migration pulses. The taboos cluster around flood surges and fragile transitions. The village calendar was not guessing. It was observation condensed into culture. Centuries of watching became story Story became habit. Habit became law, enforced not by threat, but by repetition that felt like belonging. The narrator keeps the tone warm, almost affectionate. Elders laugh as they recall songs learned before they knew their meaning. Fishermen shrug, saying the river taught them, not the other way around. No one claims authorship. The knowledge belongs to the place. This intimacy hides a hard truth. Modern life often dismisses what it does not measure, even when it is measurably correct. If a rule cannot be graphed or time-stamped, it is labeled superstition. What survives scrutiny is often what survives bureaucracy, not what sustains ecosystems. Lantern light flickers on faces turned toward the water, not in desire, but respect. The river passes unbothered by hunger tonight. It is busy keeping an appointment written into its own body. Children ask why they cannot fish. Adults answer with stories instead of numbers. The stories stick. Years later, those children will stop without asking, their bodies remembering what their minds never calculated. The section lingers on the quiet power of this method. Culture became storage, songs replaced calendars, dances replaced alarms. The river's timing was protected by beauty rather than enforcement. Modern systems promise precision, yet often break rhythm. Extraction ignores pauses. Markets reward speed. Seasons blur into availability. The river, stripped of its calendar, becomes unpredictable only because its signals are no longer heard. As the night deepens, the music softens. Nets remain untouched. Somewhere beneath the surface, life continues undisturbed, exactly as it has at this point in the year for longer than anyone can remember. With the river's calendar revealed, the warmth begins to fade into warning. The next section turns toward the cost of ignoring this timing, and how modern extraction breaks old rhythms, turning predictable seasons into sudden shocks that arrive without song, without warning, and without patience for those who forgot how to listen at night. The documentary shifts away from lanterns and songs and into a brighter, harder world of pumps, drains, and schedules set by demand instead of season. Water moves now at the pull of switches and contracts. The river is asked to perform on time, every time, regardless of what it needs. The narrator describes a simple mistake with enormous consequences. Taking water when the river needs it most. Not stealing it entirely, just borrowing it at the wrong moment. The camera follows a river through a hot period, when the sun presses down and shade becomes survival. At this exact time, water is lowered upstream. Pumps draw steadily, answering distant needs with mechanical patience. The river thins when fish need depth to escape heat. Pools shrink. Shelter disappears first. Wetlands that should be full and soft are left dry. They were meant to act as sponges, holding excess and releasing it slowly. Instead, they crack and harden, losing the ability to absorb what will come later. The damage is quiet, nearly invisible, until it is too late to reverse. Downstream, fields are thirsty in a different way. They were promised water later in the season, after early extraction fed cities and industries far away. The promise arrives thin, soil weakens, crops grow shallow roots, unprepared for stress that should have been softened by timing. The twist arrives gently, almost as an aside. Cities may have forecasts, sensors, and models, yet still behave as if the river is an endless tank. If water is available now, it is taken now. The calendar becomes flexible. Demand replaces rhythm. Villages with no screens and little data treated the river as a timed system. They understood exhaustion not as emptiness, but as mistiming. Take too much at the wrong hour and the damage multiplies later. They learned this through hunger, then remembered it through restraint. The narrator's tone stays calm, almost hypnotic, while tension rises underneath. When timing is broken, disasters do not arrive like lightning strikes. They arrive as slow collapses. Fish populations thin quietly, year after year. Soil loses strength, harvest by harvest. Wetlands fail to absorb floods they once softened, turning ordinary rains into sudden surges. Nothing appears dramatic at first. Each decision feels reasonable in isolation. The river still flows, water still reaches taps, only patterns begin to fray. A sensor reports acceptable levels, a forecast promises rain soon. Extraction continues. But the river's internal clock has already been disrupted. The rain arrives on hardened ground. Floods rise faster than expected. The same water taken too early now returns too quickly. This is the paradox the section holds gently in view. More information does not guarantee better timing. Knowing the future is not the same as respecting the present. The river responds not to prediction, but to sequence. Stealing water isn't only about quantity, it's about the moment you steal it. Remove water during the river's vulnerable hours, and the system weakens everywhere at once. The damage does not stay where the pump stands. It travels through time. The documentary shows a wetland years later, unable to recover. A fisherman waits longer each season. A farmer plants deeper, hoping roots will reach what used to arrive naturally. None of them can point to a single moment of failure. The mistake was spread thin, repeated patiently, normalized. The river's calendar still exists. Snowmelt still arrives. Heat still peaks. Fish still spawn when conditions allow. Humans are the ones who stopped showing up on time. This is not framed as ignorance but impatience. Modern systems are designed for immediacy. They reward taking now and fixing later. The river does not work that way. It keeps time without negotiation. As the section closes, the camera returns to the water itself, flowing steadily, unchanged in expression. It has not lost its rhythm. It has been ignored. The implication settles quietly. Space and timing are laws written into water, not suggestions to optimize around. Break either and the river will compensate later, collecting what was taken early with interest. The story prepares to move again, away from extraction and toward construction. Timing and space have been broken by impatience and control. The next law reveals how villages built with humility instead of strength, and why modern strength, when misplaced, can become the most fragile choice of all. The narrator introduces a different kind of engineering. Structures that don't challenge the river, they negotiate with it. In villages along old bends, building began with listening. Where the current leaned, hands leaned back. Where banks softened, people followed. The section explores methods that look modest at first glance. Woven barriers made from willow branches flex when water presses, returning to shape when it passes. Planted banks knit soil with roots, slowing erosion without drawing a line the river must break. Small weirs sit low and patient, guiding flow into many paths instead of forcing one narrow command. These designs appear fragile, almost temporary. Yet they endure because they move with water rather than resisting it like a rigid fist. When floods arrive, the structures breathe. They sway, sink slightly, release pressure, and survive by yielding in small ways again and again. The documentary lingers on materials chosen for memory rather than strength. Willow branches cut in winter and set in spring. Stones placed by hand, angled to split force, not stop it. Channels shaped to spread energy across wider ground so nothing takes the full blow alone. Underneath these choices sits a simple law. If the river must change, let it change gently. Villages did not aim for permanence. They aimed for continuity. A structure that lasts forever invites disaster. A structure that expects repair invites care. Viewers watch quiet labor unfold. Repairs are small and frequent, done after ordinary rains, not postponed until catastrophe demands heroics. A loosened stone is reset. A branch is replaced. Silt is moved before it hardens into a problem. Maintenance is seasonal, like planting or harvest. This habit matters more than any single design. By fixing little things often, villages avoided the shock of total failure. There were no once-in-a-century rebuilds because nothing was allowed to grow that brittle. The river tested these works constantly, and they answered with constant attention. The tone becomes soothing as repetition fills the frame. Hands move in practiced rhythms. Conversation drifts. Children carry light loads and learn where to place them. Community repair is not an emergency. It is a calendar entry. The river is portrayed not as an enemy, but as a powerful partner whose moods must be respected. When it shifts course slightly, the structures shift with it. When banks retreat, new edges are planted farther back. Nothing insists on winning. The strongest river walls were the ones that knew how to bend. Strength here is measured by recovery, not resistance. When water leaves, the village remains ready, not ruined. Modern eyes may mistake this for weakness. Yet the survival record tells another story. Flexible works fail softly, revealing stress early. Rigid works hide stress until it explodes. One demands humility, the other demands denial. As the camera pulls back, the river glides past living edges that look unfinished by design. They are unfinished because they expect tomorrow. This engineering trusts change and plans for it. Up close, the work leaves no monument, only continuity. After storms, no one waits for declarations or funding. People walk the banks, note changes, and respond before damage announces itself. This approach accepts loss in inches to avoid loss in lives. It favors adjustment over pride and learning over certainty. Each season teaches something small, and those lessons are applied immediately. The river notices this posture. It meets flexible edges with calmer force, spreading rather than striking. Nothing here pretends to conquer. Everything is prepared to adapt, again and again, without surprise, without speeches, without the false comfort of believing strength must always be hard to last. Across generations, this patience quietly outlived floods, failures, and time. The question forms quietly as the section closes. If softness works, why do modern systems keep choosing hardness? The answer waits in a principle that sounds like surrender, yet functions as strategy, ready to be revealed where control is loosened on purpose. The narrator tells a story that feels uncomfortable to modern ears because it centers on loss chosen deliberately. In one village, a field is opened to flood so that homes will not. Channels are cleared. Low land is offered back to the river without argument. This is not failure. It is planning. Villages practiced something modern minds resist instinctively: controlled surrender. They understood that when water arrives with force, it must be allowed somewhere to release it. If every boundary is defended, pressure multiplies. If one place yields, others are spared. The "wait, what?" moment lands quietly but firmly. The village did not survive because it was strong everywhere. It survived because it chose what to lose. Sacrifice was not random. It was calculated, remembered, and shared. The documentary dramatizes a decision made before a storm. Elders gather, pointing toward low ground already marked by past floods. Younger people argue, fearful of losing crops or effort. Voices overlap briefly. Then the discussion ends, not with victory, but agreement. Work begins immediately. Channels are opened wider. Small barriers are lowered instead of reinforced. The river is given an exit before it demands one. Families move tools and animals uphill. No one pretends the loss is painless, but no one doubts the necessity. The narrator's voice remains steady, almost soothing, so the choice feels ancient rather than tragic. This was not panic. It was rehearsal. The field had flooded before and would flood again. Its purpose included loss. They saved the village by letting the river win on purpose. That sentence reframes everything. Winning here does not mean dominance. It means continuation. The law beneath the story is simple and unyielding. Never gamble everything on a single barrier. Spread risk. Keep exits for the river. If water has nowhere to go, it will take everything instead. Villages built humility into their landscapes. Certain lands were never claimed fully. They were held lightly with the understanding that some seasons belong to water. This knowledge softened decisions long before storms forced them. The section hints at a modern discomfort with this idea. Admitting vulnerability feels like weakness. Any plan that sounds like giving up is rejected before it is understood. Cities promise absolute protection because compromise sounds like defeat. Yet the village example reveals a deeper intelligence. By choosing loss early and in small amounts, they avoided catastrophic loss later. Their systems failed gently, predictably, and recoverably. Nothing collapsed all at once. The camera lingers on the flooded field after the storm. Water spreads calmly, slowed by grasses that expect it. Downstream, homes remain dry. Children return quickly. Repair begins before resentment forms. No one blames the river. No one blames the decision. The loss was part of the design. The community absorbs it together, then moves on. This approach demands trust and memory. Everyone must believe that sacrifice will be shared fairly over time. Everyone must remember why the field exists. The law survives only if the story survives. As the section closes, the contrast sharpens without accusation. Modern systems fear loss so deeply that they invite disaster instead. They defend every inch until failure arrives with nowhere left to go. The documentary prepares to move forward toward the obsession with absolute protection. What happens when surrender is removed entirely? When strength hardens into rigidity? The next section follows that path, where control turns rivers into weapons, and the refusal to yield becomes the most dangerous gamble of all. A towering wall rises beside the river, straight and confident, its surface unbroken by roots or reeds. The channel below it has been forced into a narrow line, trimmed of curves, disciplined into efficiency. Modern confidence stands here in concrete form, visible and reassuring at first glance. The narrator describes the seduction gently. Hard structures offer certainty, at least on paper. Measurements look clean. Lines feel final. A wall promises safety you can point to, touch, and trust without thinking further. It suggests that the problem has been solved, permanently. But beneath that promise hides a cost rarely discussed aloud. Rigidity stores trouble. When water is denied its small movements, its small releases, pressure accumulates quietly. Nothing looks wrong until everything is. The wait, what? Lands in a single image. A wall that held for years collapses in minutes. Not gradually, not politely. One section gives way and water explodes through like a released spring, carrying with it everything the wall was meant to protect. The failure is not proportional, it is total. Villages avoided this cliff-edge risk by design. They never allowed the river to build a debt. Pressure was released early and often through bends, floodplains, and sacrificial ground. Loss arrived in inches, not miles. Damage stayed repairable. Modern design sometimes does the opposite. It collects force until it becomes unpayable. Straightened bends speed the current. Narrowed channels increase its weight. Every protected area pushes danger elsewhere, concentrating energy that will eventually demand release. The documentary moves slowly, allowing dread to bloom without sound effects or alarm. The river flows faster through engineered sections, its surface deceptively smooth. Speed hides itself well. What looks calm can be violent underneath. The narrator does not describe the river as vengeful. There is no anger here, only loyalty. Physics keeps its promises even when humans forget theirs. Water obeys gravity. Pressure seeks release. These rules do not bend for confidence. Another image settles in. Downstream neighborhoods flood that never did before. The wall upstream worked exactly as intended, redirecting danger. Protection succeeded locally and failed systemically. The river did not change. The map did. Hard walls don't defeat the river. They only delay the argument. When it resumes, the stakes are higher and the voices louder. Years of calm breed certainty, and certainty invites building closer, trusting more deeply, stacking value behind the barrier. When failure comes, it does not negotiate. The stored energy arrives all at once, turning manageable water into a sudden weapon. The damage feels shocking only because the warning was gradual and ignored. Villages never chased this kind of certainty. Their structures admitted weakness openly. They leaked, flexed, and required attention. Because they failed gently, they taught lessons early. Because they needed care, they kept people watching. Modern strength often hides its fragility behind armor. Maintenance is delayed, stress is invisible, confidence grows faster than understanding. By the time cracks appear, there is little time left to respond. The section does not argue against engineering. It questions the kind chosen. Strength that refuses to bend becomes brittle. Protection that cannot fail safely becomes dangerous. Control without humility turns rivers into tests no wall can pass forever. The camera lingers on a repaired bend where water slows naturally, then cuts back to a rigid channel rushing onward. The contrast speaks without words. One system expects change, the other denies it. As the sequence closes, the wall stands again, newly reinforced, taller than before. The river flows obediently beneath it. For now. The narrator asks quietly what this confidence is built on. Understanding or hope, reinforced with steel. Is modern strength actually a fragile promise wearing armor? The question is not accusation. It is invitation. The story prepares to move beyond structures and toward people, toward enforcement and memory. After engineering comes authority. Who ensured villages followed these laws when no wall stood between water and home? And what replaced that authority when modern systems arrived, confident enough to forget why rules existed at all? The narrator introduces a figure found in many places under different names. The river keeper. Not a king, not a police officer, but a trusted role shaped by patience rather than power. Part mediator, part memory, part warning bell, the keeper belonged to the river's rhythm more than to any household. By lamplight or dawn mist, the keeper learned the river's moods. Clouds were read for weight and direction. Bank plants were watched for subtle changes in color and posture. Flow was measured with simple markers placed where generations had agreed to look. None of this granted ownership. The keeper did not own the river. The keeper guarded the agreement around it. Authority arrived slowly, earned through service and consistency instead of force. The keeper organized repairs after small floods, not waiting for damage to announce itself. When water turns were disputed, the keeper listened first, then reminded everyone what the rules already were. When fish needed rest, the keeper announced bans that sounded like advice but carried the weight of memory. Shame was one of the keeper's tools, used sparingly. Those who fouled the water or stole time were not dragged away. They were named quietly in front of neighbors whose trust they had broken. The keeper did not punish. The community responded because the keeper's voice reflected their shared survival. The documentary frames this role as translation. The river could not speak in words, only in rising and falling, clouding and clearing. Someone had to turn those signs into guidance humans could hear. The keeper did this daily, without ceremony, so others could work without fear. We see hands placing stones back into a softened bank, led by the keeper's nod. We hear a calm announcement at dusk that tomorrow the nets stay dry. No argument follows. The voice is familiar, and familiarity carries authority here. The law beneath the role is social, not mystical. The keeper held no weapon, only responsibility. If trust faded, the role faded. Another would step in because memory mattered more than title. The river did not care who spoke for it, only that someone did. The tone remains intimate, as if listening to an elder's story by lamplight. Stories surface of keepers who walked the banks at night during storms, not to stop water but to count on it. Of keepers who woke villages before dawn, saving lives without ever being thanked publicly. Viewers are invited to feel what modern life often lacks. Not surveillance, not enforcement, but someone whose job was to remember what everyone else forgot when seasons were calm. Someone who held the long view while others lived day to day. Every village had a river, and someone whose life was dedicated to translating it. This dedication was quiet and total. The keeper aged with the river, learning where it lied and where it told the truth plainly. Children learned by watching the watcher. As the section closes, the keeper stands near the water, neither above it nor beneath it. The role exists between nature and people, fragile yet enduring. And a question forms naturally, preparing the next turn of the story. If keepers existed, where did they decide disputes? And how did justice take shape without walls, seals, or stamps? The keeper's presence reduced noise in daily life. Arguments ended earlier. Decisions felt lighter because someone carried the weight of precedent. This did not remove conflict, but it shortened it, cooling tempers before they hardened. In storms, the keeper became a point of gravity, drawing people together without command. In calm years, the keeper faded politely into background routine. When modern systems arrived, this role thinned, then vanished, replaced by signs and sirens. Something subtle was lost with it, a living memory that could adapt, forgive, and warn in the same breath, holding continuity when structures failed. Long after, communities noticed the silence but struggled to explain why. Beneath a wide tree canopy, a circle forms without being called. Mats are laid. People arrive at their own pace and sit where they always have. The river is close enough to be heard, close enough to remind everyone why they are there. The narrator describes a court without a building, a place where problems are discussed in the open, because nothing about water is private. Here, the river's troubles are handled where everyone can see everyone else. No benches rise above the ground. No one wears a symbol of rank. Authority comes from presence and memory rather than elevation. The keeper sits among them, not at the center, listening first. The documentary reenacts a hearing drawn from many villages into one quiet scene. Water was taken at night, more than a turn allowed. A bank was damaged by careless digging. A fish trap was set during weeks everyone knows are forbidden. Each act is small on its own. Together they threaten balance. Witnesses step forward, and none are strangers. They are neighbors who will share water tomorrow, whose children play together, whose fields touch at the edges. Testimony is not performance. It is recollection. Someone speaks of footsteps heard before dawn. Someone else points to where the bank gave way. The river itself, flowing nearby, is treated as the final witness. The "wait, what?" arrives quietly, not announced. Power here does not belong to the loudest voice or the strongest body. In many communities, those trusted most are the ones who manage water daily. Often they are women who draw it, elders who remember its moods, or those whose survival depends most directly on its health. Their observations carry weight because they notice what others overlook. A woman describes how the water tasted different that morning. An elder recalls a year when the same mistake led to illness. No one interrupts. The keeper nods, not in agreement, but recognition. This knowledge is not abstract. It is lived. The accused speaks. There is no lawyer to shape words. Explanation comes plainly, mixed with fear and pride. The circle listens without rushing. Judgment is not a spectacle, it is a task. When the verdict comes, it is designed to restore balance rather than simply punish. The fish trap is removed, and the offender will help replant reeds along the damaged bank. Extra labor is given to those whose water was stolen. For a time, the offender's turn comes last. The goal is correction, not removal. The narrator's voice stays calm, steady as breath. The court feels like a heartbeat rather than a hammer. No one leaves triumphant. Relief comes from knowing the system still works. The law here is communal memory turned into action. That memory has faces, names, and shared histories. It cannot be outsourced or forgotten easily because everyone present will feel the result tomorrow. The river's court had no walls because the whole village was the wall. Justice held because people remained connected, bound by consequence rather than procedure. As the gathering dissolves, there is no closing statement. People stand, stretch, and return to work. The matter is settled not because it disappeared, but because it was absorbed and addressed. The section closes with a subtle shift in tone. A court like this works only if the community respects it, and respect requires knowing who is responsible. When the keeper speaks, everyone knows why. When the circle decides, everyone knows how. The narrator lets the next question surface gently. What happens when this clarity is replaced by paperwork, offices, and distant authority? When rules arrive without faces and harm arrives without a name? The river continues to flow past the tree, unchanged. The people move away, carrying the decision with them. The story prepares to follow the moment when the keeper's voice is replaced by forms and warnings, and when nobody in the circle can say, with certainty, who is meant to answer when the water rises or falls. The narrator treats the river like a storyteller who never speaks directly, only in hints left for those patient enough to notice. Villagers learned this language early. They knew the river rarely warned with noise or force. It preferred suggestion. Insects clustered differently along the bank before a rise, gathering where dampness crept outward. Birds changed their perches, lifting higher even while the water still looked calm. Small bubbles appeared in places that were usually still, as trapped air escaped soil already loosening beneath the surface. The smell of mud shifted first, turning sweet and heavy hours before danger arrived. The documentary becomes sensory, leaning close instead of pulling back. Ripples cross each other in unfamiliar patterns. Reeds hush when they should rustle. Frogs fall silent all at once, leaving a space where sound used to be. Nothing dramatic happens, yet everything feels adjusted. The law underneath these moments is simple. Never assume the river is fine just because it looks calm. Calm is often the river preparing, not resting. Attention here is not curiosity, it is survival. A child is shown standing at the water's edge with an elder, both looking down. The child points and asks why the water looks darker near the bend. The elder does not answer immediately. He waits, letting the child watch longer. Then he explains that the color means the river is pulling from places it does not usually reach. Space is about to be needed. Nearby, an elder points to a specific plant growing low and fast along the bank. When its leaves spread wide and thin, the river is hungry for room. It has begun to press outward underground, even if the surface still behaves politely. The narrator's voice remains omniscient but gentle, guiding without urgency. Villages developed this language of signs because the river rarely gives warnings in words. It communicates through behavior, through absence, through shifts so small they feel meaningless unless you have learned to listen. Modern people often walk past these messages without noticing them at all, not because they are blind, but because they were never taught the alphabet. A quiet bend looks peaceful, a clear surface looks safe. The story beneath is missed entirely. The camera lingers on hands hovering just above the water, not touching, feeling temperature changes that instruments might smooth into averages. It follows eyes tracking insects, ears catching the wrong kind of silence. Attention is shown as a practiced posture, not an instinct. Villagers did not wait for certainty. They moved when signs aligned, even if proof had not yet arrived. Waiting for confirmation meant waiting too long. The river rewarded early listening with time. The hook settles naturally into the scene. The river does not shout first, it whispers. By the time it raises its voice, options have already narrowed. These signs were never collected into manuals. They lived in repetition. Children learned them by watching adults pause, change direction, lift tools, or simply stop working for the day. Knowledge passed through bodies before it passed through words. The section avoids urgency, allowing calm to teach its own lesson. Disaster is not prevented by panic. It is prevented by noticing what others overlook while everything still looks fine. As the sequence closes, the river remains smooth, reflective, almost inviting. Nothing happens. That too is the point. The danger has not arrived yet, but the message has. If signs were everywhere, the narrator asks softly, how did villages preserve them when memory fades and people move on? The answer waits in the most unexpected place, where knowledge survives even when attention slips. The next section opens the door to music and story, showing how rivers taught humans to remember by singing the warnings into existence long after the water itself had passed. The unraveling begins quietly. A riverkeeper retires, thanked politely, replaced by a notice pinned to a board. A new authority arrives with forms, phone numbers, and an office far away. Nothing dramatic happens at first. The river flows as it always has, but something essential slips out of view. The section frames this shift as a disappearance rather than a takeover. Problems once solved in daylight under a tree now become phone calls unanswered, delays explained by procedure, and shoulders lifted in apology. Responsibility stretches thin across departments until it belongs to no one in particular. The twist unsettles without shouting. Modern governance, meant to increase order, can make people feel less responsible, not more. When enforcement becomes someone else's job, attention relaxes. The river becomes an afterthought shared by everyone and protected by no one. The documentary shows the fallout in small, believable scenes. Illegal dumping appears one night and remains the next morning, unchallenged. Water turns are ignored because no voice announces them anymore. Banks are altered quietly after dark, each change defended as temporary, harmless, necessary. The old system was never perfect. It depended on trust and proximity, and it failed when those weakened, but it made consequences immediate and social. If you broke a rule, you faced neighbors, not paperwork. The cost was felt quickly, and correction followed while memory was still warm. Now, distance cools everything. Complaints are filed, investigations are opened. By the time a response arrives, the moment has passed. Harm settles in as routine. No one feels cruel, everyone feels busy. The narrator remains gentle, almost mournful, describing the loss like a language going extinct. Words still exist, but meaning thins when no one speaks them daily. The river laws survive on paper, yet no one can recite them from memory anymore. An elder walks past the old meeting place and pauses. The chair where the keeper once sat is empty, weathered, unnecessary. No one claims it. Children pass without asking questions. The river moves by, indifferent to absence, carrying reflections of clouds that do not wait. When the keeper vanished, the river didn't change. The people did. Without a human translator, the river's signals grow easier to ignore. Rising levels become statistics, unusual colors become anomalies. Warnings arrive as alerts instead of voices. This shift does not come from malice. It comes from diffusion. Modern systems promise fairness through distance, yet distance erodes care. When no one feels watched by neighbors, rules soften into suggestions. When consequences arrive later, urgency dissolves. The documentary avoids nostalgia traps. It does not suggest returning to a single figure or simple past. It observes what was lost: immediacy, memory, and shared responsibility. Accountability once lived in faces, now it lives in folders. A quiet scene lingers. A form flutters against a fence near the river, unread. The water slides past, carrying debris no one recognizes as theirs. The chair remains empty, slowly bleaching in the sun. Time refuses to reverse. The river keeps moving forward, unconcerned with governance models. But the absence is now visible. Something that once held attention together has loosened. As the section closes, the narrator prepares the path forward without promises. To rebuild accountability, modern life must learn what villages actually listened to. Not nostalgia, but signs. Tiny clues the river still offers, waiting for eyes willing to notice again. It is tempting to believe that technology can replace memory, that sensors can stand where people once stood. Yet the river responds to presence, not paperwork. When eyes stop walking the banks, patterns fade from awareness. When voices stop naming change, change feels sudden. The lesson is not to resurrect keepers exactly as they were, but to rebuild roles that bind knowledge to care. Someone must notice first, Someone must speak early. Someone must remain when urgency passes. Without that, warnings arrive late and responsibility scatters. The river does not require belief, only attention. It waits with patience older than policy, offering signals daily. Whether anyone learns to read them again will decide if accountability returns or if absence hardens into habit, and the empty chair becomes the most accurate monument modern water ever builds. Silently, consequences continue flowing onward. The documentary leans into mystery with a question that feels almost playful. Why do so many river communities sing about bends, stones, and months? Why do their oldest stories linger on places that seem ordinary, even dull, to anyone passing through for the first time? The narrator reveals the answer slowly, like turning a page that was always there. Oral tradition worked as a living notebook. In places where paper rotted and ink faded, memory needed rhythm. Stories were not only entertainment, they were storage. Tales about spirits punishing greedy fishers were never just about fear. They were safety instructions disguised as drama. A warning wrapped in wonder travels farther than a rule spoken once. When a story is frightening or beautiful enough, it survives. A verse about the river bride's angry week sounds like myth until it is placed against the calendar. That week aligns with spawning season, when nets must stay dry. A song about stones that wake at night marks the month when currents shift and footing becomes dangerous. The language feels magical, but the timing is precise. The wait, what? Arrives as the narrator points out repetition. Lines recur unchanged across generations, not because people resisted creativity, but because precision mattered. Which bend floods first? Which bank collapses after long rain? Which moon pulls the current hardest? These details are locked into rhyme so they cannot drift. The tone remains tender, almost intimate, like listening to an old bedtime story. Yet discovery sharpens beneath the calm. Culture carried data. Melody preserved sequence. Drama preserved urgency. The documentary does not claim perfection. These stories did not predict every flood or prevent every mistake. They worked in probabilities, not guarantees. But when panic hit, they offered something better than silence. They offered direction remembered under stress. A grandmother hums softly as she works, repeating lines learned before she knew their meaning. Later, when water rises unexpectedly, those same lines surface uninvited, guiding her feet away from danger without calculation. Wisdom does not always announce itself as wisdom. Villagers did not separate myth from measurement. They blended them, because memory prefers images to numbers. A river bride is easier to recall than a chart. An angry spirit stays vivid when fear narrows attention. Stories survive where instructions fail. They didn't write it in books. They hid it in stories people couldn't stop telling. That hiding was protection, not deception. Knowledge dressed as entertainment resists forgetting. The narrator emphasizes how repetition preserved order. Songs were sung the same way each year. Stories were told with the same pauses. Children corrected adults if a line was missed. Accuracy mattered, even when the teller could not explain why. This was not blind faith. It was trust built on results. When people followed the stories, fewer died. When they ignored them, consequences arrived quickly enough to reinforce memory. Pattern taught belief. The river's laws survived because they were pleasant to carry. They fit into evenings, into work, into sleep. They asked for attention without demanding study. In this way, survival knowledge became companionship. As the section unfolds, viewers are invited into the quiet thrill of decoding. What once sounded like superstition reveals structure. What felt like fantasy reveals mapping. The river was charted in metaphor long before it was charted in lines. The narrator keeps the mood gentle, careful not to break the spell. Wonder remains intact even as usefulness becomes clear. Beauty is not dismissed, it is credited. As the final images linger on water moving past familiar stones, a new question begins to form. If villages relied on senses and stories to stay alive, what replaced those tools in cities? What was gained and what was quietly lost? The story prepares to move forward, toward instruments and screens, toward measurements taken far from the water itself. The next section explores the modern trade that followed. Living attention exchanged for distant instruments, and the danger that appears when people stop trusting what their senses notice, even when the machines agree. The narrator walks through a city where the river is watched by machines. Gauges blink quietly. Alerts wait inside servers. Reports are filed on schedules no one remembers. The water itself moves beside roads and offices, treated as scenery until it becomes a headline. Here, the paradox appears without drama. Modern systems can measure more than ever, yet citizens feel less connected than ever. Numbers arrive constantly, but meaning arrives late. The river is present, but distant, observed rather than known. The "wait, what?" settles in when experts speak plainly. The data often exists long before disaster. Levels rise, temperatures shift, flow changes subtly. Action comes late not because the river hid, but because responsibility was spread thin. The river became a bureaucratic problem instead of a shared relationship. The documentary contrasts two kinds of listening. A villager hears a change in the water's sound and knows something is wrong. An office waits for a threshold to be crossed on a screen. Both can be accurate. Only one is immediate. The narrator's tone remains calm, almost drowsy, as the city moves through routine. People jog beside the river without glancing at it. Phones glow brighter than the surface. The water murmurs unnoticed, carrying signals no one is trained to hear anymore. Then the cut arrives, flashing warnings, sirens, evacuation orders scrolling across screens. Faces look surprised, not because the flood is extreme, but because it feels sudden. The river appears to have changed its mind overnight. In truth, it has been speaking the entire time. The section lingers on this disconnection. Instruments are precise, but habits are absent. Data without daily attention becomes noise. Alerts compete with everything else demanding urgency. By the time they are taken seriously, the river has already moved on to its next sentence. They had the numbers, but they didn't have the habit. That absence explains more than any technical failure. Listening used to be continuous. Now it is conditional. Modern offices rely on thresholds because thresholds simplify responsibility. Below the line, nothing must be done. Above it, everything becomes emergency. The river does not respect these boundaries. It shifts gradually, patiently, waiting for humans to notice without forcing them to panic. Villagers listened without instruments because listening was part of living. Cities listen through intermediaries, and intermediaries slow response. No one is at fault, yet no one is close enough to care early. The narrator avoids accusation. This is not a story about ignorance. It is about intimacy lost. When people stop knowing the river, they stop anticipating it. Surprise replaces preparation. Fear replaces adjustment. The camera returns to the city river at night. Lights ripple across the surface. Sensors continue their quiet work. Somewhere upstream, changes continue unnoticed. The river does not mind being measured. It minds being ignored. The lost law here is not only about rules, it is about relationship. Rivers forgive mistakes made early and corrected gently. They punish delay without emotion. Distance turns small errors into crises. As the section closes, the narrator suggests a way forward without nostalgia. Modern tools are not the enemy. They are incomplete, alone. Numbers must be paired with presence. Sensors must be paired with watchers. Reports must be paired with care. Listening can be rebuilt as a habit, not a warning system. Attention can return without abandoning technology. The river still offers signs to anyone willing to look up from the screen and notice patterns instead of alerts. With listening defined, the story turns toward recovery. What happens when modern communities rediscover old laws and try them again, without pretending it is the past, but without repeating its forgetfulness either? This recovery is not loud or heroic. It begins with walking the banks again, slowly, repeatedly, until familiarity returns. It asks for neighbors, not just notifications. It rewards curiosity before certainty. Old laws do not demand rejection of modern tools, they ask for partnership. When attention becomes local again, numbers regain meaning. When people relearn the river's moods, forecasts gain context. The story moves forward into examples where this reunion begins, imperfect but real, proving listening can be taught again. Without nostalgia, without denial, with patience returning one observation at a time daily. The narrator introduces a shift in the modern world. People who once dismissed village wisdom now circle back to it. Scientists, planners, and local activists begin using words that sound strangely familiar, phrases borrowed from somewhere older than policy. Give the river room, restore wetlands, work with the flow. These ideas return quietly, not as fashion, but as recognition earned after failure. They arrive without banners, confident voices, or promises, only evidence shaped by water itself over time again now. The section frames this movement as rediscovery, not trend. Cameras follow projects where floodplains are reopened, concrete peeled back, and rivers allowed to breathe outward again. Banks are replanted with reeds and trees whose roots accept erosion as conversation. Channels curve slowly, surrendering speed for patience. The mood is hopeful but restrained, because each success carries a quiet question underneath. If these methods work so well, why were they abandoned in the first place? The answer never arrives immediately, and that delay keeps curiosity awake longer than expected by design. The documentary lingers on careful work done without urgency. Earth is moved by machines, but decisions are guided by listening. Engineers consult maps, then walk the banks anyway. Elders stand nearby, silent, watching water behave the way it always has. One of them smiles faintly and says, almost to himself, that they used to do this. The law feels familiar, yet slightly disguised, as if returning in clothes cut for a different century. Nothing here is radical, only patient, precise, and unexpectedly comforting to those watching closely from shorelines nearby. The narrator keeps the audience suspended between optimism and suspicion. Progress appears real, measurable, promising. Yet memory intrudes gently, asking why catastrophe was required before humility returned. The river is not impressed by rediscovery. It responds the same way it always has, rewarding space, punishing haste. The feeling is not triumph, but alignment, as if something misaligned has quietly slid back into place without applause or announcement. This return feels inevitable now, though it was once unthinkable to planners working under pressure and expectation from voters, budgets, timelines, and fear. Viewers are shown before and after landscapes that feel almost shy about improvement. Floodwaters spread wider and lower, neighborhoods stay dry, wildlife returns without ceremony. Still, the question remains unresolved, hanging like mist above the current. If these solutions are ancient and effective, what blocked them for so long? The documentary refuses easy answers, suggesting that forgetting was not accidental but comfortable, profitable, and deeply human. It took distance, control, and confidence to erase lessons learned through survival. Undoing that erasure takes time, humility, and patience rare in urgent cultures today everywhere. A village elder watches a modern restoration from the bank, hands folded, eyes steady. Machines hum where hands once worked, yet the outcome looks familiar. He does not celebrate or criticize. He simply says that this is how the river prefers it. The line carries no pride. It carries relief. The law has returned wearing new clothes, speaking new languages, but asking for the same respect. It does not demand belief, only cooperation renewed across scales. From headwaters to cities, slowly again learning old patience through modern means once more. The hook settles naturally. The future of river safety may be hidden in the oldest habits humans ever had. Hope appears, but it is cautious, aware of how easily rediscovery can become slogan. Success depends not on copying the past, but on understanding why it worked and choosing it deliberately now when shortcuts tempt and memory fades. The river offers proof, but people must accept responsibility. Without that choice, restoration remains fragile and easily reversed under pressure from crises ahead. Rediscovery is one thing, testing it is another. The story now moves toward resistance, doubt, and habit. When modern cities try to adopt ancient laws, the greatest obstacles are rarely technical. They live inside minds trained to equate control with safety. The next section enters that tension carefully, where psychology resists what water already knows without argument or force yet. A modern community attempts a bold experiment, and it feels like stepping backward at first. Instead of squeezing the river tighter, planners propose stepping away from it. The narrator frames the decision like a gamble that offends a city mindset trained to defend every inch. Land will be surrendered. Flooding will be allowed, but only in chosen places. Building lines will move, not because of failure, but intention. Resistance surfaces immediately. Property owners fear value will vanish with the water. Shopkeepers worry about customers avoiding areas labeled floodplain. Some residents call the plan wasteful, arguing that open space produces nothing. Others bristle at timelines measured in decades rather than election cycles. The river has always been treated as a problem to solve quickly. Waiting feels like weakness. The documentary lingers on these objections without judgment. Fear is shown as reasonable, not selfish. People built lives around promises made by walls and maps. To loosen those promises feels like betrayal. Anger follows fear closely, especially when officials speak about sacrifice without first acknowledging loss. Then the "wait, what?" arrives, not as spectacle but accumulation. After the first controlled flood, damage is smaller than expected. Water spreads gently across designated ground and recedes without tearing foundations apart. Emergency calls drop. Repairs are cheaper. The river leaves quietly, as if relieved. Over time, other changes follow. Water quality improves as wetlands filter runoff naturally. Fish return to stretches long considered empty. Birds nest where concrete once reflected heat. None of this requires abandoning modern life. The city does not become primitive. It becomes observant. The narrator emphasizes the emotional hurdle rather than the engineering. Machines can move earth. Laws can redraw zones. The harder work is internal. People must grieve the illusion of total control. They must accept that safety does not come from domination, but from allowance carefully planned. Interviews reveal the hardest part was not construction. It was trust. Trust that the river would behave as history suggested. Trust that neighbors would share loss fairly. Trust that giving something up now would not mean losing everything later. This trust had to be rebuilt from fragments. The hook settles naturally into the narrative. The real redesign wasn't the riverbank, it was the city's ego. Letting go of certainty opened space for cooperation, patience, and memory to return. The documentary shows meetings where voices soften over months. The word surrender disappears, replaced by adaptation. Children play in new green corridors that double as flood space. What once looked like wasted land becomes valued pause, a buffer between urgency and consequence. Still, the tone remains careful. Success is contextual, not universal. The narrator reminds viewers that humility does not eliminate risk. It rearranges it into forms that can be absorbed without collapse. The river remains powerful. The difference is no longer pretending otherwise. As the section closes, the experiment stands as proof, not promise. Change is possible without fantasy, but not without discomfort. The community learned that control feels safe until it fails, while cooperation feels uncertain until it works. If success is possible here, a deeper question waits underneath. Why were these laws forgotten so thoroughly that rediscovery feels radical? The next section turns toward that mystery, revealing that the loss was not accidental. It was gradual, profitable, and disguised as progress, patiently erasing memory while calling itself improvement. This final image holds steady on water moving through reclaimed space, neither wild nor imprisoned. People watch without demanding proof, learning to wait again. The river responds not with miracles, but reliability. Floods still come, yet they arrive softened, shared, survivable. What was lost returns slowly as practice, not belief. The experiment does not close the story. It opens it, suggesting that humility scales when communities choose it together, and that remembering old laws may be the most modern act left for them all. Now, quietly, without applause or fear at last, together again. The narrator pulls back the curtain slowly. The laws did not vanish overnight. They were buried under layers added one decision at a time until the original shape could no longer be seen. Ownership papers replaced shared agreements. Short-term profit replaced long memory. Riverfront aesthetics replaced riverfront respect. The "wait, what?" lands with a chill. Many cities did not forget the laws at all. They sidelined them. Ignoring them made rapid growth easier, smoother, faster to approve. Memory became an obstacle. Restraint became inefficiency. The river was still there, but its voice was politely excluded from meetings. Language did the quiet work first. Floodplains became available land. Wetlands became empty. Rivers became infrastructure. Each word carried permission. What had once been a relationship was reframed as a resource. What had once demanded listening now asked only for management. The narrator remains calm, allowing recognition to do the work. This shift was not evil. It was effective. Growth accelerated. Cities expanded. The benefits arrived quickly, while the costs drifted downstream and into the future. Forgetting, it turns out, can be engineered. The documentary shows maps layered over time. Curves straightened, names changed. Old warning lines fade beneath zoning colors. Nothing dramatic marks the moment of loss. It looks like progress doing what progress does best, simplifying complexity into something sellable. The river was rebranded, and with the rebrand came permission. Permission to confine it. Permission to borrow from it early. Permission to return waste later. Permission to assume it would adapt forever. The laws did not disappear. They were filed away in plain sight. As the section widens, all the earlier rules reappear like puzzle pieces finally fitting together. Space was removed to gain land. Timing was ignored to meet demand. Fairness dissolved when distance hid consequence. Cleanliness suffered when responsibility scattered. Softness was replaced by strength. Keepers were replaced by forms. Listening was replaced by thresholds. None of this happened by accident. Each choice made sense on its own. Together, they built a system optimized for speed, not memory. The river adapted until it could not without cost. The narrator avoids cynicism. This is not a story about villains. It is a story about incentives. What is rewarded grows. What is inconvenient fades. Ancient laws asked for patience, humility, and shared loss. Modern systems rewarded certainty, control, and immediate return. The audience is invited to feel the chill without despair. If forgetting was designed, remembering can be designed too. Attention can be rebuilt. Roles can return in new forms. Language can change again. Floodplains can become rooms once more. Rivers can be neighbors again, not just lines on maps. The calm voice leaves a final challenge hanging. The question is no longer whether the old laws worked. They did. The question is whether modern societies are willing to choose them again, knowing what must be given up. The final chapter waits just ahead. It does not promise a return to the past. It offers a covenant for the future, written with old wisdom and modern tools, asking how to live with rivers honestly, deliberately, and on time. That covenant begins with choice rather than nostalgia, and with responsibility rather than blame. It asks planners to measure success in seasons, not quarters, and neighbors to accept inconvenience as a form of care. It asks engineers to design for failure that teaches early, and leaders to reward patience publicly. It asks language to slow down, to name floodplains as breathing space, and rivers as partners. It asks cities to build memory back into streets, schools, and routines, so attention survives turnover. None of this requires abandoning growth. It requires redefining it. Growth that remembers costs less later. Growth that listens, adapts sooner. The river does not demand perfection. It asks for room, time, fairness, cleanliness, softness, keepers, and listening, again and again. These are not ancient relics. They are operating principles waiting to be chosen. The curtain closes without certainty, but with direction, inviting those who watch to notice which laws they reward tomorrow and which they quietly file away again, knowing the river will record either decision faithfully. History listens quietly, responding later, without appeal, explanation, or mercy ever again. The narrator begins assembling a modern version of the forgotten laws, not as commandments but as principles anyone can grasp. This is not invention. It feels like rebuilding a broken compass, cleaning dirt from markings that were always there, waiting to be read again. Give rivers space to expand, and they soften instead of strike. Share water with visible fairness, and suspicion loses its grip. Protect upstream as if downstream were family, because it is. Follow seasonal timing like a promise, not a suggestion, and tomorrow stays generous. Build in ways that can bend without breaking. Restore roles that keep memory alive, even if their titles change. Learn to notice signs before alarms, whispers before sirens. None of this requires returning to village life. It requires translating old agreements into modern shapes. The documentary treats this assembly gently, like laying tools on a table rather than issuing orders. Cities can translate ancient laws into zoning that respects floodplains, restoration that reopens wetlands, community monitoring that puts eyes back on banks, and education that teaches children how to read water. The tone stays dreamlike but grounded. Close-ups linger on hands planting reeds, on planners walking floodplains with elders, on children learning why a certain insect matters. These scenes insist the laws are not distant policy. They are everyday choices made visible, practiced repeatedly until they become habit. What emerges is empowerment without guilt. No one is asked to save the river alone. The invitation is to align daily decisions with patterns that already work. A city plan becomes a promise kept across seasons. A sidewalk becomes a reminder of where water needs to go. The hook settles naturally. What if the next great city plan is simply an old village promise, written clearly again? The idea feels smaller than innovation and larger than reform. It feels like remembering how to point north after walking in circles. This section does not pretend principles are effortless. Translation takes patience. Laws must be adjusted to local history, climate, and risk. But the compass works anywhere because it points to relationship, not technique. Space, timing, fairness, cleanliness, softness, keepers, listening. These are directions, not blueprints. Viewers are encouraged to see themselves inside the frame. Planting days, public walks, shared monitoring, school lessons by the bank, small acts that rebuild attention. When attention returns, alarms become less necessary, and response becomes earlier, calmer, cheaper, and kinder. The narrator keeps the promise practical. No village is copied, no past is romanticized. Modern tools stay, but they are paired with presence. Data regains meaning when people also watch, walk, and talk about what they see. As the section closes, the laws feel close enough to touch. Hands in soil, feet on wet grass, voices sharing memory without ceremony. The compass needle steadies. Direction returns without force, inviting the audience to carry it forward. This is synthesis meant to be shared, not archived. A clear takeaway replaces overwhelm. Rivers respond to what is rewarded daily. When cities reward room, patience, care, and attention, water responds with time. The dreamlike mood persists because change begins quietly. Nothing needs to be announced. The work shows itself over seasons. Children grow up fluent in signs. Planners learn to walk before they draw. The river notices. With principles assembled, a natural question narrows the lens. Inspiration is generous, but people still ask what one person can do today. The next section brings the story closer, into habits, streets, and choices that start now. The compass does not demand perfection. It asks for alignment again and again. Each small turn counts. Each day offers a chance to choose direction over drift, memory over forgetting, partnership over control. These laws become ordinary when practiced. Ordinary is powerful. It lasts. The river responds to ordinary care with extraordinary patience, returning what is given, slowly, faithfully. That patience is the gift modern cities forgot how to receive together now. The narrator narrows the story until it touches the viewer's own world. The river they drive over without slowing. The drainage canal behind their home that only matters when it smells. The stream that disappears under streets and parking lots, treated as plumbing rather than presence. These are not distant systems. They are neighbors most people have never learned to greet. The section offers grounded actions, but they are framed as small river laws rather than duties. Learn where water goes after rain. Follow it for a few blocks. Notice which streets flood first and which stay dry. Support green spaces that hold water quietly instead of forcing it away fast. Reduce what enters drains because drains lead somewhere, always. The documentary does not list tasks like orders. It invites curiosity. Notice seasonal changes in the water's color or speed. Question development in places that already show signs of overflow. Join local cleanups not as charity, but as participation in something older than policy. And most importantly, pay attention, even when nothing dramatic is happening. Paying attention is framed as remembering rather than fixing. The river does not need saving from individuals. It needs to be noticed before damage becomes normalized. Attention turns anonymous systems back into relationships. The narrator avoids preaching, keeping the tone almost soothing. Responsibility is not described as burden, but belonging. When people know the river near them, they behave differently without being told. They pause, they ask questions, they resist shortcuts that feel wrong even if they look legal. Here, the gentle twist arrives. The river laws were never only government rules. They were shared behavior, reinforced daily by habit and expectation. Policy followed culture, not the other way around. When enough people behaved as if the river was owed respect, boundaries hardened naturally around that respect. You don't need to live in a village to follow village river laws. You only need to stop living like the river is someone else's problem. This realization feels lighter than expected. It does not demand purity or sacrifice. It asks for awareness extended just a little farther than convenience. The camera shows ordinary scenes. Someone pauses before tossing something into a gutter. A family walks a greenway after rain, watching water spread instead of rush. A resident asks a question at a planning meeting that changes the tone of the room. None of these moments look heroic. That is why they work. The narrator emphasizes scale gently. One person does not change a river, but rivers are changed by accumulation, for better or worse. Attention accumulates too. It creates pressure that moves systems slowly, persistently, without slogans. As viewers listen, the laws feel less like instructions and more like posture, a way of standing in relation to water. Upright, curious, accountable. The section reminds the audience that most rivers now live underground or behind barriers. Out of sight encourages forgetting. Remembering begins with locating what was hidden, lifting a map, following a culvert, asking where the water goes next. The calm tone persists because urgency has already done its damage. Panic leads to force. Attention leads to adjustment. The river responds better to the latter. As this chapter closes, agency feels real because it is modest. Nothing here requires permission. Nothing here demands expertise. The river accepts beginners. With agency established, the documentary prepares to return to its opening image, the flood. Not to frighten, but to complete the circle. The final reveal waits there quietly, ready to show who has always been writing the law all along. The answer is not hidden in nature or government alone. It lives in daily choices repeated until they become normal. The river records those choices faithfully. It always has. And when enough people remember that, the water begins to behave differently, not because it was commanded, but because it was finally understood again. Night returns, and with it a different kind of quiet. The river moves under moonlight, smooth and unhurried, carrying reflections that break and reform with every bend. It sounds almost thoughtful now, as if the day has ended and the river is free to speak the way it prefers. The narrator delivers the final reveal without urgency. Humans can ignore river laws, rewrite them, rename them, or bury them in paperwork. None of that changes the terms themselves. The river enforces its own rules through physics and time, patiently, without memory or malice. It does not argue. It demonstrates. Images return, now rearranged into coherence. Pale flood lines etched into tree bark are no longer curiosities. They are sentences written by water. Water turn rituals are not quaint habits, but schedules of survival. Empty floodplains are not wasted land, but reserved space. Soft banks are not weak engineering, but intelligent design. The keeper's empty chair is not nostalgia, but absence made visible. Each piece fits. Together they form one system that was never mystical and never random. The laws were always practical, enforced not by belief, but by consequence. The river was predictable when treated honestly. Chaos only appeared when humans insisted on pretending otherwise. The ending does not lean toward despair. It settles into something steadier, almost comforting. Predictability is a kind of mercy. A river that follows gravity and season can be lived with, planned for, and trusted. Uncertainty comes not from nature, but from denial. The narrator's voice remains calm, as if lowering the lights rather than raising alarms. Perhaps the forgotten laws were never truly forgotten by the river. Perhaps they were only forgotten by people who stopped watching closely enough to remember. The covenant is offered gently, not demanded. Remember willingly, or be reminded harshly. The river does not punish. It responds. It collects what is ignored and returns it when the conditions are right. Final visuals unfold without hurry. A child stands beside the water, tracing a flood mark on a tree with small fingers. The line is higher than expected. The child looks from the mark to the river, curious rather than afraid, as if meeting an old friend whose stories are just beginning. The hook settles into the moment. The river does not need humans to remember its laws. Humans need rivers to survive breaking them. The sentence lingers, not as threat, but as truth. Moonlight glides across the surface. Somewhere upstream, water presses softly against its banks. Somewhere downstream, it loosens its grip and spreads. Nothing here is dramatic. Everything here is exact. The story closes without instruction, leaving a question instead. The next time the viewer crosses water, drives over it, hears it behind walls, or watches rain disappear into a drain, the documentary follows quietly alongside. What law is the river asking you to honor today? There is no correct answer spoken aloud, only attention offered, only memory waiting. The river continues, unchanged, carrying the record forward whether or not anyone chooses to read it again.